Case number 1 is that of Susan Cummings. In the rolling Emerald Hills of Warrenton, Virginia, wealth isn't just a status symbol, it is a shield. Susan Cummings was the heiress to a massive fortune, the daughter of a billionaire international arms dealer. She lived a life of insulated luxury at Ashland Farm, a sprawling estate that served as the backdrop for her romance with Roberto Villegas, a charismatic Argentine polo player. To the local community, they were a glamorous fixture of the horse country set. But on the morning of September 7, 1997, the glamour was washed away by bloodshed. Police rushed to the main house to find a scene of absolute chaos. Roberto was dead, slumped in the kitchen, his body riddled with 4 bullets from a 9mm semi-automatic pistol. Susan was there, hysterical, claiming that this was the tragic end to a cycle of abuse. She told investigators that Roberto had threatened to kill her, and she had acted in desperate self-defense. As evidence of his brutality, she presented her arms, which were covered in fresh, bloody knife wounds. At first glance, it appeared to be a clear-cut case of a victim finally fighting back. But think about the silence that follows a gunshot, and what the evidence whispers in that silence. When forensic pathologists examined Susan's wounds, the story of self-defense began to unravel. The cuts on her arms weren't jagged or defensive. They were shallow, perfectly parallel, and tentative. These were hesitation marks, classic signs of self-infliction. The forensic reconstruction suggested Roberto wasn't attacking her. He was likely sitting at the table, eating his breakfast, when Susan walked in and executed him. The betrayal here is profound. She not only took his life, but attempted to destroy his memory by framing him as a monster to cover her tracks. However, in the courtroom, the truth often finds itself at war with high-priced storytelling. Susan's team of elite defense attorneys masterfully spun the narrative of battered woman syndrome, turning the courtroom into a theater of sympathy. The strategy worked. The jury acquitted her of murder, convicting her only of voluntary manslaughter. The result was a sentence that many considered a slap in the face to the concept of justice. For killing Roberto Villegas, Susan Cummings was sentenced to 60 days in jail and ordered to pay a $2,500 fine. She served just 51 days before returning to her billion-dollar lifestyle. It serves as a dark reminder that while the law applies to everyone, the consequences are often negotiable if you can afford the right negotiators. Case number 2 is that of John Allen Muhammad. Fear usually has a face. You fear the angry spouse, the gang member, the robber. But in October 2002, the entire Washington, D.C. metropolitan area was paralyzed by a fear that had no face, only a sound, the crack of a high-powered rifle. For 3 weeks, doing the mundane became an act of bravery. Pumping gas, mowing the lawn, or walking to school could be the last thing you ever did. This was the reign of the beltway snipers, and the architect of this terror was John Allen Muhammad. The betrayal here strikes at the very core of civic duty. Muhammad was a Gulf War veteran, an expert marksman trained by the United States military to protect the innocent. Instead, he weaponized that discipline against them. While the police and media were frantically hunting for a white box truck, Muhammad was hiding in plain sight in a blue Chevrolet Caprice .2. He had modified the vehicle into a mobile killing machine, cutting a firing port through the trunk and removing the back seat, so he could lie prone, hidden and lethal, taking shots while traffic rolled right past him. He shot 13 people during the DC attacks, killing 10. But it wasn't just about the body count. It was about the psychological domination. He left tarot cards at scenes, one inscribed with "Call me God." He wanted the authorities to know he was the one pulling the strings. Think about the arrogance required to demand that kind of recognition, and yet, it was that exact arrogance that destroyed him. He called the tip line to brag about a previous unsolved murder in Alabama to prove his credibility. That call led investigators to a fingerprint on a magazine, which identified him. On October 24th, police found the blue Caprice parked at a rest stop. The man who wanted the world to see him as an omnipresent god was found asleep, vulnerable, and cornered. John Allen Muhammad was convicted of capital murder. The jury saw past the soldier to the predator beneath. In November 2009, the state of Virginia executed him by lethal injection. 3. He spent his final weeks trying to orchestrate terror, but in the end, he died strapped to a gurney, silenced by the very system he tried to hold hostage. The ultimate irony is that for a man who demanded to be called God, he died a very mortal and very forgotten death. Case number 3 is that of Teresa Lewis. There is a terrifying intimacy to a crime committed within a marriage. We accept that danger exists in dark alleys or bad neighborhoods, but we never expect the person sleeping beside us to be the architect of our demise. In October 2002, Julian Lewis and his son, CJ, were living a quiet life in rural Virginia. Julian was a hard-working man, and CJ was a reservist preparing for deployment. They believed the woman in the house, Teresa Lewis, was their partner and mother figure. In reality, she was a predator counting down the minutes until their deaths. Teresa Lewis wasn't interested in divorce. Divorce splits assets. She was interested in life insurance, specifically a payout of $250,000. But Teresa was not a physical killer. She was a manipulator. She seduced 2 younger men, Matthew Schallenberger and Rodney Fuller, using a toxic mix of sexual favors and promises of cash to mold them into her personal hit squad. On the night of October 30th, she didn't just leave the door unlocked. She practically invited the devil inside. While Julian and CJ slept, the hitmen entered the home. Teresa waited in the kitchen, fully aware of what was happening down the hall. Shots rang out. Julian was killed instantly. CJ lingered in agony for almost an hour before succumbing to his wounds. Think about that betrayal for a second. Hearing the people you are supposed to protect dying in the next room, and doing nothing but checking your watch, waiting for the silence that means the money is yours. Her plan, however, was as sloppy as it was cruel. She was caught withdrawing large sums of money to pay the killers before the bodies were even cold. When investigators pressed her, the grieving widow facade cracked. She confessed, but tried to downplay her role. The judge wasn't buying it. He labeled her the head of the serpent, the cold, calculating mind that had set the violence in motion. While the 2 gunmen received life sentences, the justice system reserved its harshest punishment for the puppet master. Teresa Lewis was sentenced to death. In September 2010, she became the first woman executed in Virginia since 1912.3. Her final moments were a stark contrast to the chaos she unleashed. She died quietly by lethal injection, a permanent end to a life defined by a greed so consuming it devoured her own family. Case number 4 is that of Boyd Malvo. If John Allen Muhammad was the architect of the DC sniper attacks, Boyd Malvo was the weapon he forged. In 2002, Malvo was just 17 years old, a quiet, impressionable teenager who had been bounced around the Caribbean and the United States, starving for a father figure. He found one in Muhammad, but instead of guidance, he received indoctrination. Muhammad didn't raise a son, he programmed a soldier. He taught the boy that emotion was a weakness, and that killing was a necessary grim duty to correct a corrupt world. While Muhammad drove the blue Caprice, it was often Malvo, curled into the fetal position in the trunk, who peered through the firing port and pulled the trigger. The betrayal here is a dual-layered tragedy: the betrayal of society by a murderous duo, and the betrayal of a child by the adults sworn to protect him. Malvo was trained to suppress his humanity, turning off his conscience to execute innocent people pumping gas or shopping for groceries. He was a child soldier fighting a war that existed only in his mentor's mind. The turn, in this case, came when the pair was discovered sleeping in their car at a rest stop in Maryland. When police arrested them, they didn't find a hardened commando, they found a teenager under the thrall of a madman. In the interrogation room, Malvo initially tried to take the fall for everything, reciting the script Muhammad had drilled into him. It took time for the programming to crack, revealing a boy who had been brainwashed into believing he was part of a righteous mission. The judicial system faced a complex dilemma. How do you punish a weapon? Malvo was convicted of capital murder, but his age saved him from the death penalty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Over the years, laws regarding juvenile offenders have shifted, leading to resentencing hearings and debates about whether a 17-year-old is truly irredeemable. Today, Malvo remains incarcerated, a man now older than the mentor who ruined him. His story ends with a heavy thematic punch. We often look for monsters under the bed, but the scariest monsters are the ones we create. John Allen Muhammad is dead, but the ghost of his influence lives on in a cell where Boyd Malvo sits, a living testament to how easily a young soul can be hijacked and turned into an instrument of death. Case number 5 is that of Meghan Hargan. Sibling rivalry often fades with age, but for Meghan Hargan, it fermented into a lethal envy. In the wealthy enclave of McLean, Virginia, the Hargan family appeared to have it all. But behind the doors of their million-dollar estate, a war was brewing over money. Meghan, 35, was desperate to close on a new home she couldn't afford. She needed roughly $400,000 immediately, and she believed her mother, Pamela, was the bank vault she held the combination to. When Pamela refused to fund the purchase, Meghan decided that if she couldn't inherit the money, she would take it by force. On July 14, 2017, the desperation peaked. Meghan shot her 63-year-old mother, Pamela, in the laundry room of their home. But silencing her mother wasn't enough. She needed a scapegoat. Upstairs was her younger sister, 23-year-old Helen, successful, beloved, and the perfect patsy for Meghan's twisted narrative. Meghan shot Helen, and then, with chilling composure, she staged the scene. She positioned the .22 caliber rifle to make it appear as though Helen had snapped, murdered their mother, and then committed suicide. It was a betrayal of the highest order. Meghan didn't just end her sister's life. She tried to destroy her legacy, painting her as a matricidal monster to cover her own greed. But think about the arrogance of that plan. Expecting the police to believe a successful young woman would suddenly massacre her family. The turn came when investigators followed the money. They discovered that on the very day of the killings, someone had attempted to wire over $400,000 from Pamela's account to the title company for Meghan's new house. That someone had even impersonated Pamela on the phone. The digital greed left a footprint that no amount of staged evidence could hide. Furthermore, the forensics of the suicide were impossible. The angle of the wound and the length of the rifle meant Helen physically could not have pulled the trigger on herself. The jury saw through the elaborate theater. Meghan Hargan was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms in prison. The irony is suffocating. She killed her family to secure a dream home she felt she deserved. In the end, she secured a permanent residence, but it wasn't the suburban house with the white picket fence. It was a concrete cell where the only view is the consequence of her own envy. Case number 6 is that of Jesse Matthew. University towns exist in a bubble of perceived safety. In Charlottesville, home to the University of Virginia, students walk the streets with a sense of invincibility, trusting that the community is there to protect them. Jesse Matthew exploited this trust with terrifying precision. To those who knew him, he was the friendly giant, a former hospital orderly and cab driver who was a fixture in the local nightlife scene. He was large, jovial, and seemingly harmless. But beneath that disarming exterior lived a serial predator who hunted vulnerable women under the guise of helping them. On the night of September 13, 2014, 18-year-old Hannah Graham was lost. She had wandered away from a party, disoriented and alone on the downtown mall. This was the moment Matthew had been waiting for. Surveillance footage captured the chilling interaction. Matthew approaching her, wrapping a protective arm around her, and leading her into the darkness. To a passerby, it might have looked like a good Samaritan helping a stumbling student. In reality, it was a spider wrapping its prey. Hannah was never seen alive again. Her remains were found weeks later in a desolate field. But think about the scope of this betrayal. It wasn't an isolated incident. The capture of Jesse Matthew pulled on a thread that unraveled a decade of mystery. When forensic experts obtained his DNA, it didn't just match evidence from Hannah Graham's case. It triggered a hit in the database that linked him to the unsolved 2009 murder of Virginia Tech student Morgan Harrington and a brutal sexual assault in Fairfax back in 2005. For years, Matthew had been living among his potential victims, hiding behind his friendly persona while the families of the missing agonized for answers. The weight of the forensic evidence was crushing. Realizing there was no escape, Matthew entered a plea agreement to take the death penalty off the table. He pleaded guilty to the murders of both Hannah Graham and Morgan Harrington. The judge sentenced him to 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Jesse Matthew will die in prison, but the scar he left on Virginia is permanent. He serves as a terrifying reminder that safety is often an illusion. The monster isn't always lurking in the bushes with a mask. Sometimes, he is the smiling man at the bar who offers to walk you home, using his perceived kindness as the ultimate weapon against you. Case number 7 is that of Piper and Rountree. We expect criminals to be desperate, uneducated, or impulsive. We rarely expect them to be officers of the court. Piper and Rountree was a former prosecutor, a woman who had stood before judges and argued for the rule of law. She knew exactly how evidence worked, how alibis were checked, and how murders were solved. Yet, when she decided to eliminate her ex-husband, university professor Frederick Jablin, she didn't use her legal mind to seek justice. She used it to try and commit the perfect crime. The couple had been through a bitter, scorched-earth divorce, with Frederick winning custody of their children. For Piper, this was unacceptable. On the morning of October 30th, 2004, Frederick walked out of his Richmond, Virginia home to pick up the morning paper. He never made it back inside. He was gunned down in his own driveway, executed in the quiet of dawn. 2. But here is where the story takes a bizarre turn. Piper didn't just drive over and shoot him. She treated the murder like a heist movie. She lived in Texas, so she flew to Virginia using her sister's identity. She donned a disguise, a blonde wig and baggy clothes, to transform herself. She tried to create a phantom, a killer who didn't exist, believing her knowledge of criminal procedure would keep her one step ahead of the detectives. However, intelligence is often blind to its own arrogance. The perfect plan was riddled with holes. She had used a credit card to buy the wig. Phone records placed her in Virginia, not Texas. And perhaps most damning, her sister, whose identity she had stolen, cooperated with the police, dismantling Piper's alibi piece by piece. The prosecutor became the defendant, and her own legal training couldn't save her from the mountain of forensic evidence she had left behind. Piper and Rountree was convicted of first-degree murder. The woman who once put criminals behind bars was sentenced to life in prison. She traded her law degree for a prison number, driven by a rage that blinded her to the very principles she had sworn to uphold. It stands as a stark lesson. Knowing the law doesn't make you above it. And sometimes the smartest person in the room is the one who underestimates the truth. Case number 8 is that of Ricky Javon Gray. New Year's Day is universally celebrated as a time of rebirth, a moment when we reset the clock and look forward to the future with hope. But for the Harvey family in Richmond, Virginia, January 1st, 2006, marked the end of everything. Brian Harvey, a well-known musician, and his wife Catherine, a business owner, were preparing for a party. Their 2 young daughters, Stella and Ruby, were playing in the house. It was a scene of perfect domestic warmth. They didn't know that walking the streets outside was a force of pure, chaotic evil looking for an opportunity. Ricky Javon Gray and his nephew, Ray Dandridge, were on a drug-fueled spree, hunting for a house to rob. They noticed the Harveys' front door was open, a simple oversight in a safe neighborhood. That open door was an invitation to a nightmare. Gray and Dandridge entered and forced the family into the basement. What happened next defies the boundaries of human empathy. This wasn't just a robbery gone wrong, it was a slaughter. Gray bound the family with tape and then, methodically and brutally, slit their throats and bludgeoned them. He wiped out an entire generation in minutes, not because they fought back, but simply because they were there. Think about the darkness required to look into the eyes of a 4-year-old child and decide she cannot live, just to eliminate a witness to a burglary. After the massacre, Gray set the house on fire, hoping the flames would consume the evidence of his atrocities. But the fire of the Harvey home was just one signal in a week of terror known as the Richmond Spree murders, where Gray left a trail of bodies across the city. The turn came swiftly. The sheer volume of violence Gray unleashed made it impossible to stay hidden. Police connected the spree through forensic evidence and the recovery of stolen items. When interrogated, Gray didn't cower. He confessed with a terrifying lack of remorse, detailing the murders as if he were recounting a grocery list. While Dandridge pleaded guilty in exchange for life in prison, the justice system had no mercy for the man who held the knife. Ricky Javon Gray was convicted of capital murder. In January 2017, the state of Virginia executed him by lethal injection. The execution closed the case, but it couldn't answer the lingering question that haunts Richmond to this day. How can a simple unlocked door be the difference between a happy new year and a shallow grave? The Harvey family did nothing wrong, and that is the most terrifying part of this story. Sometimes, evil doesn't need a reason, it just needs an entrance. Case number 9 is that of Clara Jane Schwarz. For most people, role-playing games are a harmless escape, a way to inhabit a world of dragons, magic, and heroism for a few hours. But for Clara Jane Schwarz, the line between the game and reality didn't just blur, it dissolved completely. Clara, a student at James Madison University, was deeply immersed in a dark fantasy world, obsessed with vampires, magic, and the occult. Her father, Robert Schwartz, was a brilliant biophysicist, a man of science and logic. He lived in a remote farmhouse in Loudoun County, Virginia, grounded in reality. To Clara, however, he wasn't a father. He was the villain in her personal storyline, an obstacle that needed to be removed to complete her quest. On December 8, 2001, the fantasy turned visceral. Robert was found dead in his home, a scene that looked less like a crime and more like a medieval execution. He had been stabbed more than 30 times with a 27-inch sword, and an X had been carved into the back of his neck. The brutality was staggering, but the orchestration was even more disturbing. Clara hadn't wielded the sword herself. Instead, she acted as the dungeon master, manipulating a young man named Kyle Hulbert, a mentally fragile friend who believed in the fantasy world as much as she did. Clara spun a web of lies, telling Kyle that her father was physically abusing her and poisoning her with magic. She cast her father as a monster, and she tasked Kyle, her loyal protector, with slaying the beast. Think about the psychological depth of that betrayal. She weaponized a young man's mental illness and desire for acceptance to murder her own father, all while she stood back and watched the narrative play out. The turn came when the police investigated the odd group of friends. They found no evidence of the abuse Clara claimed. Instead, they found journals, emails, and conversations that detailed the plot. It became clear that Robert Schwartz was a loving father concerned about his daughter's mental health, and his only crime was trying to get her help. The monster wasn't the man in the farmhouse. It was the daughter he tried to save. Clara Jane Schwartz was convicted of first-degree murder for orchestrating the attack. She was sentenced to 48 years in prison. Kyle Hulbert, the hand that held the sword, received life without parole. The tragedy of this case lies in its finality. In a game, you can resurrect a character or restart the level. In reality, the blood doesn't wash off, and the game over screen is a prison cell door slamming shut forever. Case number 10 is that of Christopher Darnell Jones Jr. 4 student athletes. The team bus is more than just transportation. It is a mobile locker room, a sanctuary where bonds are forged over long rides and shared dreams. In November 2022, a class of University of Virginia students, including several members of the UVA football team, took a field trip to Washington, D.C. to see a play. It was a day of culture and camaraderie. Among them was Christopher Darnell Jones Jr., a former football player who had once worn the same jersey as the young men sitting around him. But as the bus rolled back into Charlottesville under the cover of darkness, Jones wasn't thinking about the play. He was stewing in a perceived grievance that only he could see. As the bus pulled into the Culbreth Road garage, the air of exhaustion and relaxation was shattered by the crack of a handgun. Jones didn't just fire randomly. He hunted. He targeted his former teammates, Devin Chandler, Lavelle Davis Jr., and Sean Perry. The betrayal here is suffocating in its intimacy. These weren't strangers in a dark alley. These were peers he had shared a classroom and a field with. Some of the victims were sleeping, defenseless in what should have been their safest moment. Jones moved with a cold, methodical precision, executing 3 promising young men and wounding 2 others, including running back Mike Hollins, who tried to flee. The turn, in this case, is the digital footprint of his rage. Before the shooting, Jones had sent a text message that read, "They not getting off this bus." It wasn't a snap decision. It was a premeditated massacre fueled by a distorted reality where he felt slighted by the very people who had welcomed him. He fled into the night, sparking a massive manhunt that locked down the entire university campus for 12 terrifying hours, leaving thousands of students barricaded in libraries and dorms, waiting for the all-clear that felt like it would never come. Jones was eventually captured, but the damage was irreversible. Facing a mountain of evidence and the undeniable reality of his actions, he pleaded guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder and related charges. In November 2025, a judge handed down the maximum penalty, 5 consecutive life sentences. Christopher Darnell Jones Jr. will never walk free again, but his sentence cannot undo the silence he left behind. He took 3 stars from the sky and extinguished them on a bus ride home. It serves as a devastating final chapter to our list, proving that the most dangerous distance in the world isn't miles or meters, but the proximity between a man and the grudge he refuses to let go.